the government claims it has broad support outside of the capital. And to see if that rhetoric holds true, I spent a week talking to various people, from uneducated farmers to struggling factory owners, from self-confident women to a grand ayatollah. Iran is a country of contradictions, but there was a common thread. Thank you so much.
That clip was from the New York Times columnist Nick Kristof's recent journey to Iran. Iran is a tough place for a journalist, almost impossible to get a visa in the first place. Then if you're able to get in, you're under tight restrictions. That's why Kristof's access was rather extraordinary. Not only was he granted a visa, but the Iranian authorities allowed him to travel from Mashhad in the east to Tabriz in the west, unescorted. I invited him to come in and talk about what he saw and what he heard. Welcome back, Nick.
Thank you.
So what was your dominant impression given this access? Because you've been to Tehran, but what felt different about being outside Tehran?
Well, I mean, as you know, one of the extraordinary things about Iran is how pro-American everybody seems at the grassroots. You go to Pakistan, you go to Egypt, and we pour billions into these places, and everybody seems to hate us. We go to Iran, and everywhere you go, people want to buy you tea or invite you into their homes. It is just stunning, the pro-American quality of the country. I think more broadly politically, I was reminded, that absolutely there is still support for the regime, for the government in rural areas, among less educated people, people who don't have access to satellite television. But all of the larger social forces seem to me to be working against the government. More educated people, more urbanized people, people who do have international connections, just are more and more fed up with the system. They're upset by the economic downturn. And they don't really blame the West for sanctions. They blame their own government.
Did you get a feel for whether or not the religious nature of the regime is being questioned? In other words, they don't like the government, but that doesn't necessarily mean they want a whole-scale regime change and a revolution.
I was struck by how often I heard religious people say that their system is not really Islamic. And were questioning it on religious grounds. Many people seem to yearn for something a little more like Turkey, where there's a strong Islamic component to the society, yet much greater democracy, warmer ties with the West, and none of this isolation that I think really leaves people embarrassed, that here you have a country with a great civilization, an extraordinary history, and whenever you travel outside the country, you're regarded as a terrorist. I think people are frankly kind of fed up with the regime.
And it feels like also it's a great trading culture that has been closed in and hemmed in. And I was struck by in Tehran how the businessmen in particular really hated the fact that they were so isolated from the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, because Iran is now outside of the banking system, so just the simplest transactions, simplest international transactions can't be done through banks anymore. They do have these hawala systems, where the traditional Islamic system of money transfer, and that seems to be the only sector of the economy that has actually been prospering. You know, you can still walk into a hawala with a suitcase full of cash and pick it up 2 days later in Beijing. But that's a very expensive way to do business, and anybody in business is really suffering and, for the most part, blaming their own government.
You were with your kids. How did that change with two of your kids?
With two of my kids. Oh, it was fascinating. I had my 14-year-old daughter and my 18-year-old son, and my daughter in particular, I've been a little bit nervous because she would have to wear the hijab and a manteau, kind of a cloak. And she, I must say, was a wonderful icebreaker. And it was fascinating to see Iranian women interact with her, because Iran, as you know, is not monolithic. And there were more conservative, traditional women who were always trying to lower her headscarf and cover her up a little bit more. Meanwhile, young women all over Iran were saying, "Oh, you're young, you need to live a little bit." And they'd pull back her headscarf so that it was barely covering anything. And it was interesting to see the degree to which hijab can both mean truly covering things up and alternatively just be kind of a come-hither approach to traveling around.
Did you find that when you were in the rural areas there was any kind of suspicion or greater suspicion because you were a foreigner or an American?
People were so welcoming just everywhere we went, including regime supporters, and even in rural areas, I would just stop and talk to farmers. There were, I remember one woman who shouted out, be careful what you say, they're foreigners. And people were much more cautious in speaking out than on my visit in 2004. I think my sense is that Iranians can still feel comfortable criticizing the regime amongst each other casually. They don't mind if they're overheard on a bus criticizing the government, but doing anything public or formal that smacks of activism, including speaking formally to a foreign journalist, that crosses a red line. So people were much more cautious about speaking on camera, but they were friendly everywhere we went.
What conclusions do you draw? What conclusions do you draw about the sanctions and then about what we should do with their nuclear program?
My sense is that sanctions are working about as well as one could expect. I think sometimes we mislead ourselves in thinking they're hurting top officials. They are, but mostly they're hurting ordinary people. And I think we need to acknowledge that. But they are working in the sense that they are imposing tremendous economic pain around the country, and that people are, for the most part, blaming their own system for it. And I think they're creating pressure for change. But the one thing I think that could really rescue the regime and would bring about much more and keep it in existence for longer would be a new war between Iran and the West, possibly started by Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. And to me, at a time when sanctions are to some degree working, when the regime's removal or transition seems to me to be a matter of time, I think it would be a tragic mistake to engage in a military option that I'm afraid would freeze that regime in place.
Hey, Christoph, pleasure to have you on.
Good to be back.